Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast, your home for nonpartisan analysis of politics. I am your host, Paul Rader. Today, we're going to talk about ideological labels and what they mean. If you follow politics, even occasionally, you'll see ideological appeals everywhere. This person is a conservative champion. This person is a liberal warrior. This person is a whack job about whatever ideology it is. And the vast majority of the time you hear conservative or liberal, it's given a positive or negative rap. And usually tacked on are words like radical, extreme, ultra, crazy, or something along those lines. So it's hard to find useful, unbiased information on what in the world these ideological labels mean. What exactly is a conservative, or a liberal, or a moderate? That's what we're diving into today. Included in this discussion is the difference between party and ideology, how we measure ideology, the various definitions people have for conservative, liberal, and moderate, the most basic meanings of conservative and liberal, how ideological labels are used as campaign tools, how moderate is defined, and how you should think about ideological labels. Let's go. First of all, party is not ideology. Now, to some people, that might sound obvious, but Republican is often interchangeably used with conservative, and Democrat is interchangeably used with liberal. And one of my professors from grad school, Dr. Craig, is beside himself anytime he hears people confuse the two. Well, maybe not beside himself, but he made sure to make a point of it in our studies. It's a common misconception to just say Republican is conservative, Democrat is liberal, although sometimes people deliberately conflate party and ideological labels. Now, it is true, those ideologies typically align with those parties. Most Republicans are conservatives, most Democrats are liberals, but some Republicans are much more conservative than others, and some Democrats are much more liberal than others. And just saying this person's conservative, this person's liberal, doesn't necessarily give a fully accurate, well-rounded picture of what exactly they believe. Sometimes it does, but there are still also some liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats, believe it or not, as well as moderates in both parties. But that comes down to self-identification, which involves different perceptions of what a conservative or a liberal are. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in just a little bit. But the parties have become increasingly associated with these respective ideologies over time. But that being said, you still want to make sure that you don't just interchangeably say Republicans and conservatives, Democrats and liberals. So, how do we measure ideology? There's various ways that we can do that, whether you're talking about elites, which are the people that are in office, that are campaigning, that are much more ingrained in politics, and then the regular general public. So, especially with public opinion polling, how detailed you want to go depends on what your goal for the polling is. Are you simply just trying to understand the electorate as a whole, like, for example, Gallup or Pew Research Center, and you're doing this for an educational purpose, whether to just generally understand the electorate better or teach other people how the electorate thinks? Or are you trying to win an election and figure out how to tailor your message? Campaigns will tweak their messaging depending on how their poll sample is responding and who campaigns think will vote. If they think that more highly conservative people are going to vote or more highly liberal people are going to vote, they want to know who those people are that are very conservative, very liberal, and try to tailor the message so that they can effectively turn them out. Now, there is a difference between self-reporting and what people say or how they behave, because a lot of times, just in general, not even talking about politics, but just in general, a lot of times we say something and we behave in a way that contradicts what we say we actually believe. It's that whole joke about parents telling their children, do as I say, not as I do kind of thing. It's kind of like that. what people self-report as can actually be different than what they really are. People can think they are more or less conservative or more or less liberal than their beliefs actually indicate. One of these concepts is what we call symbolically conservative, operationally liberal, because people tend to, not necessarily a whole lot of people, but in public opinion polling, people tend to talk in a way that indicates they want less government involvement. But when you try to boil down to specific programs, they start to become a little bit more supportive of government involvement. For example, if you talk about government aid programs in general, or what some people would call welfare, and you talk about those just a general overview of those policies, some people will say, I don't think that government should be giving handouts to people, or whatever it is that they give as the reason. But then if you point to specific programs, like if you said Medicare specifically, or Obamacare, or Medicaid, or Social Security, now the opinions change a little bit. Some people start to become more supportive of those programs. So it's not just about what people self-report versus what they believe, but it also depends on the actual context. Sometimes you need to get a little bit deeper. If you're too broad, you won't necessarily get a fully accurate picture. So it's not just on the people who are responding to these polls, it's also on the pollsters to be able to craft the right questions to get the information that they want. And there's also a difference in, and I mentioned this just a bit ago, how ideological elites are, the politicians, campaigners, versus how ideological the public is. Public is much less ideological than elites are. The public does not think about ideology nearly as much as the elites do. Now, I know it can seem like there's a lot more ideological voters in the public, and sure, there's a decent number of them, but they just have outsized influence. They have an outsized voice because they tend to get the publicity and they tend to be more invested in politics. So you tend to hear them more often, and it gives you a little bit more of a, oh, wow, there's a lot of these people. Not necessarily. So a couple of the ways that we can measure ideology through public opinion polling is through a 7-point scale. And this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 on a continuum. And usually 1 is very liberal, 2 is liberal, 3 is somewhat liberal, 4 is moderate, 5 is somewhat conservative, 6 is conservative, 7 is very conservative. And some might put it the other way, but typically that's what you see. And it's not a value judgment. 1 is not better than 7, 7 is not better than 1. It's just to show a spatial comparison of people based on how conservative or liberal they say they are. But sometimes it's also shortened to a 5-point scale, so it might just be very liberal, liberal, moderate, conservative, very conservative. You might also just see a simple liberal, moderate, or conservative question. Pollsters like Gallup use these quite often. Might just simply say, do you see yourself as a liberal, a conservative, or a moderate? Or they might directly ask if you are very liberal, liberal, moderate, conservative, very conservative. Instead of having that multiple choice question, they might just straight up ask you more open-endedly, tell us if you are this. Another calculation, now moving from polling, and when you move from polling, there's a whole bunch of different ways that people might measure ideology. And one of these ways is an organization called VoteView, and they measure the ideology of Congress people over time, and they have a lot of data going all the way back to the very first Congress. And they have this special calculation called DW Nominate, and that estimates ideology based on roll calls, that is to say, votes on bills. So depending on what bills are being voted on, a congressperson may not get to show off their ideological stripes as much. That's why they have a specific article on the VoteView website talks about why Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Ayanna Pressley, and more people that think similarly to them. But those four in particular, why early on in their congressional tenure, they were actually rated as moderate. When you hear them talk, they certainly do not call themselves moderates. They are certainly liberal in ideology, but because of what votes were actually up on bills at the time, the way they voted just happened to look moderate. There's also, if you simply don't just have it as a basic continuum, liberal through conservative, you actually overall, you often see where there's a divide between economic and social issues. So are you economically liberal, economically conservative, socially liberal, socially conservative? And this, if you just want more data, this is obviously the way to go. But there may be reasons that you just can't do that. You just have to ask a general question of whether somebody's liberal or conservative, because some people don't necessarily make a distinction on economics and social. They just say that they're liberal, that they're conservative. And also, if you add another polling question, if you were going to ask people if they were economically conservative and liberal or socially conservative and liberal, every question you ask is more time spent on the survey. It's more money that you have to pay to a pollster to actually give out these questions to people. And then these people on the other side have to spend more time answering questions. And some people might get impatient with that. So it partially depends on the funds that you have, the experience of the pollster, who you're reaching out to, what your purpose is for the polling. Sometimes you might just ask a simple, is this person a conservative or liberal? But if you have the ability to, it is always better to try to get more complex if you can. And then, of course, you can be conservative or liberal on very specific issues, but not others within that economic or social distinction. Maybe you think the government needs to be involved in very specific aspects of the economy, but not others. Maybe there's a social view that you're very conservative on, but a social view that you're another one that you're very liberal on. Social, maybe you support same-sex marriage, but you don't support transgender athletes in sporting events, for example. So when you start peeling back the layers, it starts to get obviously more and more complex. But what also makes things more complex is how people variously define conservative and liberal. You asked 5 different people what a conservative is or what a liberal is, and you can very well get 5 different answers. In fact, it's very likely you will get 5 different answers. Some of them might sound similar, but you can still get 5 considerably different answers. And the definitions of these labels are not always honest and certainly not always devoid of value judgments. You ask somebody who's more liberal to define conservatism, they might say that it's racism, that it's sexism, that it's restrictive, that it's fascist, and so on. You ask a conservative what a liberal is, and they might say that it's woke, that it's racist, that it's oppressive, that it's socialist, and so on. Now, why are there so many definitions of these ideologies? Well, like we said, some people have a vested interest because they have a very ardent bias against those labels, or they have a very positive bias with their own labels. But campaigning tactics have a vested interest in painting ideologies a certain way. You want to use labels to elicit a Pavlovian emotional response from people so that they go, oh, I need to vote for this person, or oh, I need to not vote for this person. I need to vote for the other person. Plus, people just not being educated on the meanings of these labels. Now, that's for a bunch of different reasons. Some people just don't want to research what these labels mean. They want to just stay in their own thoughts about what exactly these labels mean. But it's also, like I alluded to at the beginning, it's hard to find the info on what these labels mean because of how much these meanings are obfuscated by campaigners and politicians. But others who could teach the meanings might also obfuscate the info themselves as well. Maybe they have their own biases, or maybe they don't really know what conservative and liberal is. So there's various definitions, not just by the people who oppose a label, but there's definitions from those who self-identify as a conservative or a liberal. So if you ask a conservative what a conservative is, they might say it's somebody who favors small or limited government, a Republican, somebody who wants efficiency, somebody who wants freedom. If you ask a liberal what a liberal is, they might say that it's a government that fixes problems, that it's a Democrat, that they favor equitable government, or that they're open-minded. And some of these definitions might have some accuracy, at least for some people and in certain contexts, but they're not the true meaning of these labels. So what is the base meaning of conservative and liberal? Because these words have been defined in many different ways by both supporters and detractors of these labels. So the true meaning of conservative and liberal gets muddied a lot. So the absolute basic meanings in their normal context, just very generally, a conservative favors a traditional role of government, and a liberal favors a non-traditional role of government. And how conservative or liberal you are partly depends on the importance you place on the need for the traditional role of government. It's partly why older people tend to be more conservative. They tend to be more in favor of tradition. They tend to support things that were more like what they had when they were younger. It happens to everybody. Well, or it is a common thing that happens. It's not necessarily right or wrong. It's just how things tend to happen over time. So what do these differences in traditional and non-traditional emphasis look like? So now we're going more into specific examples of what conservative and liberal policy looks like. Traditional, so more conservative views, typically takes a more hands-off government approach to the economy. Historically, American government tended to take a more what they call laissez-faire approach, less regulations on the economy, fewer restrictions on guns. So they tend to be more opposed to gun control. Opposition to same-sex marriage. Now, conservatives don't necessarily agree with the conservative approach on every single one of these things, but that's what tends to be the more conservative view because those are the more traditional views. Now, on the other side, liberals, the more non-traditional view of government, they see a need for more government involvement in the economy. Like if we talk about FDR, for example, in his New Deal, that was a non-traditional approach to the economy when it came to government involvement. Had a lot more involvement in the economy from the government. More gun control. More support for same-sex marriage. Again, not every liberal supports every one of these things, but those tend to be more liberal-minded. Conservative tends to be more traditional. Liberal tends to be more non-traditional. And if you look at research into personality traits and how conservatives and liberals tend to estimate on those, very basically, this is a very general view. It doesn't get into the very nitty-gritty. But conservatives tend to rate higher on conscientiousness, which is kind of a large umbrella term, but part of the conscientious label includes the adherence to traditional norms or adherence to rules, whereas liberals tend to rate higher on the openness to experience. So that's that more non-traditional view of things. Again, that's not always the case. Some conservatives will rank higher on openness to experience and some liberals will rank higher on conscientiousness. But that's just a general rule of thumb that conservatives tend to be higher in conscientiousness on personality tests, and then liberals tend to be higher on openness to experience. And then what is a conservative and what is a liberal can differ by country. So a conservative in Venezuela is not going to be the same as a conservative in the US. A liberal in Iran is not going to be the same as a liberal in the US. Now, there might be some similarities, but you have to take into account what exactly is tradition in another country versus the US. Not always going to look the same. What is a liberal or what is non-traditional in another country is not going to necessarily look the same as over here. So there may be some commonalities in ideologies between countries, but it's rarely, if ever, a one-to-one comparison. Now, I mentioned earlier that ideological labels are oftentimes used as campaign tools. They are campaign cudgels, if you will. These meanings of these ideological labels are heavily muddied by campaigns because campaigns are trying to win elections. Trying not to dunk too much on campaigns here. They're not really so much about educating you. They want to tell you about their candidate, of course, but how much of it is truth, how much of it is obfuscation, that's kind of out of the purview of this discussion. But it's not really so much about educating people, it's about trying to win elections. So they have a vested interest in painting ideologies in certain ways that they think will maximize their vote totals. So if we go back to some of the things we used earlier with how people variously define conservative and liberal, a conservative campaign who's trying to get you to vote for a conservative probably going to try to suggest to you that it's limited government, that it's efficient, that it's free. A liberal campaign that's campaigning for a liberal, they're going to tell you that the government is fixing problems, that it's about equitability and open-mindedness. Now, whether any of those things are true, that's up for you to decide. But in any case, conservatives are going to try to be positive about conservative campaigns and negative about liberal campaigns, and liberals are going to try to be positive about liberal campaigns and negative about conservative campaigns. And under that whole sphere of positivity and negativity is trying to paint these ideologies in certain ways that will hopefully make you vote for them. And they may also define these ideologies in different ways to different voters they are trying to appeal to. So if a conservative or a liberal is trying to not only appeal to their normal conservative or liberal base, but they're trying to appeal to more moderate people, the ideological appeals probably aren't going to be as strong. They're probably going to focus more on, they might take those ideological appeals and make them sound more moderate. So they're not going to necessarily say this person's a conservative champion or this person's a liberal warrior. They're probably going to say they want a government that works, that doesn't get involved in what it's not supposed to get into, or that it's fixing problems that needs to be fixed, something like that. They may go hard on the conservative and liberal appeals to one group, but they may not use those appeals at all for another group. It's all about tweaking things to maximize your vote totals as much as you possibly can. And so these ideological labels are often used as scare tactics to rally voters against somebody. Yes, obviously they want to get people to vote for them, but a lot of times it's just trying to get people to vote against somebody. And so, along with conservative and liberal, you usually see words like radical and extreme used all the time. Whether it's true or not, nobody thinks they're extreme. There's probably a few people that do, but you almost never find anybody that says, "Oh yeah, I'm extreme." It's always the other person who is. And maybe they're right. Maybe that other person is extreme, but you can't necessarily just trust their opinion on that. They're trying to win an election. So, of course, they're going to say the other person is way out there as a complete loony. And then you also hear, and this is one of my pet peeves, you often hear words like fascist, socialist, communist. These are highly favored names for people, and usually Democrats and liberals like to paint opposition as fascist, and Republicans and conservatives like to paint opposition as socialist or communist. Anarchists you don't really hear as much, I don't think, but you sometimes hear that used by one side or the other. Now, maybe once in a while that is true. Maybe there is a fascist policy or socialist or communist policy, but usually taking one specific policy idea and just saying, see, this person's a fascist or a socialist. Like, okay, that's one policy. You look at their other policies, maybe they don't really think like that. Now, maybe some people are closet fascist or socialist, but a lot of times these are words that are just used just to try to win elections, and they really just start to lose their meaning. We should be reserving fascists and socialists and communists for people who are unequivocally fascist, socialist, and communist. But I digress on that point. And another thing that you often hear is you usually hear leftist and right winger, which inherently have negative connotations. I don't think I've ever heard somebody willingly call themselves a leftist or willingly call themselves a right winger. There's probably somebody who has, but typically when you hear those are being used derisively. So it again goes back to it's another way to say radical or extreme or fascist slash socialist. So you might want to take whatever that person says with a grain of salt if they use those kinds of ideological appeals. But though, maybe in some cases they are right. Maybe that person is way to the left or way to the right. But you have to be careful accepting what they tell you. And then this also gets to now not just what one side is saying about another side, but what one side is saying about their own side. And this comes to the no true Scotsman fallacy. Basically, when somebody gatekeeps and says, oh, this person's not really part of our group. So the more hardcore conservative or liberal that someone is, the more likely they'll see some of their fellow conservatives or liberals as not conservative enough or not liberal enough. That's why you hear the term rhinos and dinos. Rhinos meaning Republican in name only, and dino meaning Democrat in name only. You especially hear rhino a lot because conservatives, the Republican Party tends to be a little bit more uniformly ideological than Democrats are, but they're still both very ideological. And again, it goes back to the whole party is not ideology. Just saying that Republican is inherently conservative and Democrat is inherently liberal. That's not necessarily people from one party complaining about another party. Sometimes people within a party complain that their party is not ideological enough. Some Republicans think that the party needs to be more conservative. Some Democrats think their party needs to be more liberal. So when you hear rhino and dino, these are derisive terms to say someone's not a true Republican because they're not conservative enough, or that somebody's not a true Democrat because they're not liberal enough. And it's somebody who's more out there who decides that this person is not a true member of the party. So again, another case of conflating party with ideology, albeit in this case, it's intentional. Some people do it because they think it's the same exact thing when it's not. Again, yes, a lot of overlap, but it doesn't necessarily get into how conservative or how liberal somebody is. And then this whole new true Scotsman fallacy, saying somebody's not conservative or liberal enough, it's also meant to keep would-be detractors within the party in line. These days it's hard for overtly anti-Trump Republicans to compete today in elections. When Obama was in office, for example, it was hard for overtly anti-Obama Democrats to compete. When one party has the presidency, that party tends to fall in line there, and you hear a lot fewer people step out of line, because if they do, they're probably going to get primaried. But here's the thing. A lot of overly ideological people don't necessarily think they're being overly ideological. I know that might sound weird, but they just think they're being practical. They think they've figured things out, that everything should be filtered through that ideological lens, and that everything can be explained by conservatism or liberalism or whatever ideological label somebody has. And all of these reasons make for why ideological appeals are so effective. We are responsive to simple appeals that activate our emotions. No matter how complex we think we are, no matter how practical we think we are, no matter how much we think we know or think critically about politics, all of us can be given to these very simple appeals that activate our emotions. Now, might not necessarily be ideology, but even those of us who don't consider ourselves very ideological, those emotional appeals, those ideological appeals still can have some effect, some influence on how we view a candidate or a current official. And despite the fact that the general voting public is much less ideological than elites, voters that care more about ideology tend to vote at much higher rates, especially in the primaries. So they tend to have a more vested interest in who wins, and they see elections oftentimes as an existential crisis, so they have an outsized influence on politics because they tend to participate more. Now, I talked a lot about conservatives and liberals, but you might remember from the very beginning, I talked about another word: moderate. So, conservative is a more traditional role for government. Liberal is a more non-traditional role of government. So where does that leave moderates? That's a tricky question for multiple reasons. Again, people have different reasons for calling themselves moderates. Maybe they really are actually more conservative or liberal, but they don't want people to think that they're crazy one side or the other. That's another problem too, is just inherently assuming that one side or the other is crazy. So they may just call themselves moderate to have a better appeal. It's like how some people call themselves independents, but some of them are more Republican or Democrat than they care to admit. And also, moderate can be used derisively, just like liberal or conservative. And to some people, being a moderate is even worse, and they won't respect you because they think, oh, you're just hedging your bets. You're not reacting. You don't want to pick a side. You're being a coward, whatever. So sometimes being a moderate has the connotation of being apathetic, of being not passionate about anything. You're just kind of, or whichever way the wind blows, I guess. I don't care. Now, moderates do tend to be less involved in politics, but it doesn't necessarily mean they don't care. Some of them don't care. They don't think at all about ideologies, and you say conservative or liberal, they just like, whatever. Some of them might care, but they just don't know enough about either side, and they don't want to align themselves that way, or at least say that they align themselves that way. So moderate can also be, if we are not careful with it, we can use that as a misnomer too. And somebody might say that they're moderately conservative or moderately liberal instead of just straight up moderate. So how do we measure that? Or they might say they're somewhat liberal or somewhat conservative. So saying somebody is moderate can also be problematic if we don't make it clear what makes them moderate. What are they moderate on? Are they moderate on the vast majority of or all the issues? That doesn't necessarily happen a whole lot where they're just moderate across the board. They might be moderate on a few things, but they might instead be very conservative on a bunch of things and then very liberal on a bunch of other things. And technically, that will even out to being moderate if you measure it that way. So technically, a libertarian can be considered moderate in this way because economically they're conservative and socially they're liberal. But they often feel very strongly about their libertarian beliefs. So is that really moderate? Or are they moderate in their general approach to politics, where they have their beliefs and they might feel very firm in their beliefs, but they're also very open to other opinions? Is that moderate? Are they just not concerned with or don't even think about ideological beliefs? Like I said earlier, the public tends to think about and care about ideology much less than elites do. And do they lean slightly conservative or liberal, but not heavily so? Like I said a moment ago, usually liberal, moderate, conservative is the simple way to describe the ideologies in public opinion polling. But what if somebody wants to say that they're moderately liberal or moderately conservative instead of saying moderate, period? Then that starts to get a little bit more complicated. How do you measure that exactly? How deep into the weeds do you want to get, and how detailed do you want to be about people's ideologies? So, all that is to say, ideology is very complicated if you really want to actually dive into it beyond just the rhetoric. So, how should you view ideological labels? Now, admittedly, this is a little bit more opinionated. I want to preface it by saying that. But I think these are very useful ways to think about ideological labels so that you don't just fall into campaign traps. Because these can be useful references. When somebody says they're conservative or liberal, it can give you a sense of what they believe, especially when ideologies are becoming more uniform or groups are becoming more uniform in their ideology. But you got to be careful not to put too much stock into them, or you'll fall into these campaign traps of biased views on these ideologies. Remember that in a lot of cases, in most cases, I'd even say, the use of conservative and liberal is mostly for ulterior purposes, not actually informing you about that candidate. People are trying to win elections. They're trying to rally support or opposition to legislative bills. They're trying to stave off primary challengers who would claim that the incumbent is not conservative or not liberal enough. If someone is giving you a clear positive or negative connotation about what a conservative or liberal is, take that appeal with a grain of salt, because they're probably telling you that for a reason. Again, does not necessarily mean that they're wrong, but because there's always, or at least most times, a reason they're telling you that a conservative is good or bad, or that a liberal is good or bad, you need to be careful automatically accepting what that person says, especially if there's somebody that you agree with. Because when we agree with somebody, all of us, we tend to be less critical of whatever they say. But when people are trying to win elections or win political battles over bills or trying to prevent primary challengers, it's going to affect how they try to appeal to you based on these ideological labels. So ideology is much more complex than a lot of people make it out to be, especially by those who are strongly conservative or liberal, because they have a vested interest in appealing to your emotions in a certain way and making things sound simpler than they are. When you talk about how complex things are, we all tend to tune out if it's not something we're already interested in. And even if we are interested in it already, sometimes we just want things broken down to us in more simple terms. When you're trying to win elections, usually nuance does not win you political battles. It's trying to make things as straightforward, clear cut. This person sucks. Our person's good. Just vote for us, or otherwise death and misery will follow. So it doesn't really behoove people to say, well, let's talk about what being a conservative is or what being a liberal actually is. It's even if you boil it down to just economic versus social, unless you're a libertarian, libertarians will make note that they're economically conservative and socially liberal. But even then, sometimes they lean more into the conservative side or the liberal side of their views, or on specific issues. Usually, people will say, you got to be conservative on everything here, or you got to be liberal on everything here. And you can't step out of line at all. You can't say, well, I'm conservative on this thing, but I'm liberal also on this thing. Usually doesn't work with people. They're going to call you sellout, coward, a spineless whatever. That you're not standing up for the American people, all that good stuff. So I also want to make clear that it is okay to have an ideology. I know I've been sounding like I've been lambasting ideologies here or not. It's more of the need for ideological purity that I'm trying to lambaste here. It's fine to have an ideology, and to some extent, you're going to have a little bit of one. It's fine to have some sort of guiding principles, and bias is inevitable for all of us. We have to be cognizant of those biases, but they're going to happen in some way, and a lot of times that will be ideological. But it should not get to the point where it is your main identity, where it is your filter for everything. Because too often our worldviews filter everything through that ideological lens. I'm a conservative, so everything that's right is conservative. I'm a liberal, so everything that's right is liberal. Doesn't work like that. Maybe some things that are conservative are right. Maybe some things that are liberal are right. Maybe some things that are moderate are right. But we can't just assume that because they're conservative, because they're liberal, because they're moderate, because moderate is not inherently right either. We can't assume any ideology is inherently right because every ideology has flaws, because we're all human beings and ideology is inherently human. So we can't just constantly rely on our ideology. We don't really learn as much as we can if we just filter everything through that ideological lens. We don't solve our problems long term if we don't step outside of that ideological lens. So just be careful with how you see ideological appeals, how you hear ideological appeals. Always think about who's the person that is giving this ideological appeal. What do I think? What are the people that are being targeted think? What do people who don't support that ideological appeal think? Try to be a bit more cognizant of all those things. Don't just automatically respond to something because it's conservative or liberal or moderate. But that is going to do it for today's episode of Politics with Paul. As always, thank you so much for listening and or watching. My links in the show notes, my Facebook, LinkedIn, my educational email course, 5 days on how we can better depolarize American politics, because sometimes we do things that accidentally inflame polarization, why we make those mistakes, and how we can fix those mistakes. My book, Why Independents Rarely Win Elections and How They Become More Competitive. It's not trying to argue for independence or against them, just saying the roadblocks they face. My medium.com profile, my website, paulrader.org, and Matchmaker FM profile if you want to be a guest on this podcast or you want me to be a guest on your podcast, or my email, paulraderwrites@gmail.com. But that is going to do it for today's episode. So, again, thank you so much for listening. Until next time, take care.